Ethan Brooks steps into Everstone Jewelers, heart racing with hope to buy a bracelet for her sister's birthday. But before he can speak, Clark Helen Carter's icy glare pins him as a thief, her voice dripping with disdain. "Where'd you steal that money?" Customers whisper, judging him by his skin. When the bracelet slips from his hands, Helen's accusation erupts, summoning police with a lie. Who is Ethan, and what secret will turn this injustice upside down? Watch to find out. Like, share, and subscribe with notifications to catch more gripping stories. The golden glow of a warm Saturday afternoon bathed Riverton, a serene suburban town where life unfolded at a leisurely pace. Children's laughter echoed from the park, families strolled through the bustling farmers' market, and the soft chime of bicycle bells mingled with the hum of polite neighborly greetings. Yet for Ethan Brooks, a 17-year-old with a determined glint in his eyes, this day carried a singular purpose that outshone the town's idyllic charm. Clutching his wallet, heavy with months of hard-earned savings from his job at Sweet Haven Bakery, Ethan approached Everstone Jewelers, Riverton's most prestigious jewelry store. His heart raced with anticipation, not just to buy a silver charm bracelet for his little sister Mia's 10th birthday, but to fulfill a promise that meant more than any gift could convey. Mia's face had lit up every time they passed the store's gleaming windows, her small fingers pointed at the delicate bracelet with its twinkling star charms. Ethan had vowed to make her dream come true, scraping together every tip and paycheck, enduring long shifts to ensure he could afford this symbol of his love. As he neared the store, the pristine glass facade reflected his image, a neatly pressed white t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, his usual hoodie left at home to avoid unwanted attention. He paused, smoothing his shirt, acutely aware of the scrutiny that often followed a young black man entering places like this. "Just buy the bracelet and leave," he muttered, steeling himself before pushing open the heavy glass door. A soft chime announced his arrival, and the opulent interior of Everstone Jewelers enveloped him. A world of sparkling chandeliers, velvet-lined shelves, and glass cases brimming with gold and silver treasures. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to the flour-dusted bakery where Ethan spent his days. Well-dressed customers, mostly middle-aged women, browsed the displays, their diamond rings catching the light as they murmured approvals over necklaces and earrings. Ethan ignored their fleeting glances, his focus locked on the bracelet he'd come for, its star charms glinting under the store's bright lights. Behind the counter stood Helen Carter, a woman in her 50s with meticulously styled blonde hair and sharp, calculating eyes. She was chatting with a customer, her smile practiced and professional, but the moment her gaze landed on Ethan, her expression shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her posture stiffened, and her eyes narrowed with an unmistakable suspicion. Ethan felt it instantly, that silent, piercing question he'd encountered too many times before. "What are you doing here?" It was a look that carried the weight of judgment, one he'd seen in countless stores, classrooms, and streets, a look that branded him as out of place before he could even speak. He pushed the feeling down, refusing to let it derail him, and approached the counter with a steady stride, offering a polite smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice clear and calm, the way his mother had taught him to speak in situations like this. "I'd like to see the silver charm bracelet with the star pendants, please." Helen's eyes flicked over him, from his t-shirts to his sneakers, her skepticism palpable. "That one?" she asked, her tone laced with condescension. "It's quite expensive, you know." Ethan nodded, unfazed, and reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet, revealing a neat stack of cash he'd painstakingly saved. "I know," he said firmly. "I have the money right here." Helen's gaze lingered on the bills, her lips curling slightly as if the sight of them offended her. Instead of softening, her demeanor grew colder. "And where did a kid like you get all that cash?" she asked, her voice dripping with accusation. Ethan's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I work at Sweet Haven Bakery," he replied, enunciating each word. "I've been saving for months to buy this for my sister's birthday." Helen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing further. "Saving, huh?" she said, her tone mocking. "You expect me to believe a story like that?" Ethan's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's not a story," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to buy the bracelet. Can you show it to me, please?" Helen sighed dramatically, as if Ethan's request was an imposition. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "But don't think you can pull anything funny. I've got my eye on you." She moved toward the display case, her movements deliberate, but her gaze never left Ethan, as if waiting for him to make a wrong move. Ethan felt the weight of her scrutiny, the sting of her words, but he refused to let it shake him. This was for Mia, and nothing, not Helen's suspicion, not the curious stares of the other customers, was going to stop him. As Helen unlocked the case, a young employee, Emily, emerged from the back carrying a tray of earrings. Her eyes met Ethan's briefly, and a flicker of recognition passed over her face. She'd seen him before, lingering outside the store, gazing at the bracelet with a quiet determination. For a moment, it seemed she might say something, but she quickly looked away, her lips pressing together as she busied herself with the tray. Ethan noticed her hesitation, a small pang of hope stirring in his chest, but it faded as Helen placed the velvet tray on the counter with a pointed thud. "Here it is," she said, her tone sharp. "Be careful with it. It's worth more than you can imagine." Ethan nodded, his fingers hovering over the bracelet, its silver surface cool and smooth. He imagined Mia's delight, her small hands clasping it around her wrist, and a smile tugged at his lips. But as he turned the bracelet to inspect its charms, the air in the store shifted, thick with an unspoken tension that set his nerves on edge. Helen's eyes bored into him, and the other customers' whispers grew louder, their glances more overt. Ethan's stomach tightened, but his heart pounded as he sensed the storm brewing just beyond the glittering facade of Everstone Jewelers. The air inside Everstone Jewelers grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made Ethan's skin prickle. He stood at the counter, the silver charm bracelet cool in his hands, its delicate star pendants catching the light as he turned it gently, envisioning Mia's joy. Helen Carter, the store clerk, hovered nearby, her sharp eyes never leaving him, her posture rigid with suspicion. The soft hum of customer whispers filled the room, their glances darting toward Ethan like needles. Emily, the young employee who had recognized him earlier, lingered at the edge of the counter, her fingers fidgeting with the tray of earrings, her eyes flickering with unease. Ethan sensed her hesitation, but before he could process it, his grip on the bracelet faltered. The smooth metal slipped through his fingers, clinking sharply against the glass counter before tumbling to the tiled floor with a faint jingle. The sound, though small, sliced through the store like a gunshot. Ethan's breath caught, his heart lurching as he instinctively bent to retrieve it, but Helen's voice erupted, shrill and accusing. "I knew it," she shrieked, jabbing a finger at him, her face flushed with triumph. "You were going to steal it, weren't you?" Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the bracelet, shock rooting him to the spot. "No, it slipped. I wasn't." Helen cut him off, her voice rising to a piercing pitch. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, stepping closer, her eyes blazing. "I saw you. You thought you could slip it into your pocket while I wasn't looking?" Ethan stood, his chest tightening, the weight of her words slamming into him. "I didn't touch it," he said, his voice louder now, trembling with indignation. "I was just holding it." The room shifted, customers turning to stare, their murmurs growing louder. Clara Thompson, a middle-aged woman in a tailored coat, stood nearby, her lips pursed as she clutched her purse tighter. "Typical," she muttered, just loud enough for Ethan to hear. They always try something. Ethan's head whipped toward her, his eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his voice sharp, challenging. Clara flinched, her face reddening, but she didn't respond, her gaze dropping to the floor. Helen, undeterred, lunged for the phone on the counter, her fingers trembling with urgency as she dialed. Yes, police. We have a thief here, a young black male trying to steal from us. Hurry. Ethan's stomach dropped, the word thief echoing in his mind like a verdict. He felt the eyes of every person in the store boring into him, their judgments suffocating. You're lying, he said, his voice low but fierce, locking eyes with Helen. You know I didn't do anything. Helen scoffed, slamming the phone down, her lips curling into a sneer. Save it for the cops. You kids think you can walk in here, act like you belong and get away with anything. Not on my watch. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to stay calm. I came to buy a gift, he said, each word deliberate. I showed you my money. I did everything right. Why are you doing this? Helen's eyes glinted with disdain. Because I've seen your type before, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You come in, flash some cash you probably didn't earn honestly, and think you can fool me. I'm not stupid. Ethan's jaw tightened, the sting of her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He glanced at Emily, hoping for some sign of support, but she looked away, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Emily, he said, his voice softer, almost pleading. You've seen me here before. You know I'm not like that. Emily's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she gripped the tray. I don't know, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I mean, I saw you looking at the bracelet, but... Her words trailed off under Helen's glare, and Ethan's heart sank. The betrayal, though silent, was palpable. The store's atmosphere grew denser, the whispers of customers now a steady hum of condemnation. A man in a suit near the necklace display shook his head, muttering, should have known better than to come in here. Ethan's chest burned, but he stood tall, refusing to let their words break him. You're all wrong, he said, his voice carrying through the room. I'm not a thief. I'm just a brother trying to make my sister happy. Helen rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, spare me the sob story, she said. You can tell it to the judge. The distant wail of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears, his mind racing with the implications of what was coming. He knew how these situations could spiral, how a single accusation could ruin everything. Yet he forced himself to breathe, to stay composed, because any wrong move could make this worse. Call my mom, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. She'll be here soon. Helen laughed, a harsh grating sound. Your mom, she mocked. What's she gonna do? Cry and beg for you? Save your breath, kid. Ethan's eyes darkened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his fingers steady as he dialed. Mom, he said, when the line connected, his voice low but urgent. I need you at Everstone Jewelers. It's bad. The sirens were closer now, their wail drowning out the store's murmurs. Helen leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, a smug smile playing on her lips. You're done, she said, her voice low and triumphant. You should have stayed where you belong. Ethan met her gaze, his eyes blazing with defiance. You don't get to decide where I belong, and you're about to find out just how wrong you are. The door swung open, and the flashing lights of a police cruiser flooded the store, casting stark shadows across the polished floor. Ethan stood firm, his heart pounding, but his resolve unbroken, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the truth and his mother were on their way. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser spilled through the glass doors of Everstone Jewelers, casting jagged shadows across the polished tiles. The siren's wail faded into an eerie silence, broken only by the heavy footsteps of two officers as they entered, their presence amplifying the already suffocating tension. Sergeant Richard Malone, a broad-shouldered man with a stern jaw, led the way, his hand resting on the handcuffs at his belt. Behind him, Officer Daniel Cruz, younger and less hardened, scanned the room with the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Helen Carter, standing behind the counter, pointed at Ethan with the trembling finger, her voice shrill with vindication. "That's him," she declared, her face flushed with a mix of fear and triumph. "He's the one who tried to take the bracelet." Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his hands raised slightly to show compliance, but his eyes burned with defiance. The weight of every gaze in the store pressed down on him, customers whispering, their faces a mix of curiosity and condemnation. Clara Thompson, the woman who had muttered earlier, stood near the necklace display, her arms crossed, nodding as if Helen's accusation confirmed her own biases. Emily, the young employee, hovered at the edge of the counter, her face pale, her eyes darting between Ethan and the officers, guilt etched into her expression. Ethan locked eyes with Malone, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I didn't steal anything," he said, each word deliberate. "She's making it up." Malone's brows furrowed, his tone gruff. "Step back, son," he ordered, gesturing toward the door. "We'll sort this out." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "Sort it out?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You mean cuff me first and ask questions later?" Cruz stepped forward, his tone softer, almost conciliatory. "Just cooperate, kid," he said, raising a hand to calm the situation. "No one's saying you're guilty yet." Ethan's eyes flicked to Cruz, a spark of hope ignited at the officer's hesitation, but it was quickly doused by Helen's venomous interruption. "Not guilty," she scoffed, slamming her hand on the counter. "I caught him with my own eyes. He dropped that bracelet like he was about to run off with it." Ethan turned to her, his voice rising with barely restrained fury. "You know that's a lie," he said, pointing at the bracelet still lying on the floor. "It fell because I was looking at it, not stealing it." Helen's lips curled into a sneer. "Keep talking," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're only making it worse for yourself." Clara chimed in from the sidelines, her voice smug. "He was acting shifty the whole time," she said, addressing Malone. "I saw him lurking around before he even went to the counter." Ethan spun toward her, his patience fraying. "Lurking?" he snapped. "I was picking out a gift for my sister. What's your excuse for judging me?" Clara's face reddened, but she held her ground, muttering, "I know what I saw." Malone raised a hand, his voice booming. "That's enough," he barked, glaring at Ethan. "Outside now, we're not doing this here." Ethan's chest heaved, but he stood firm, his eyes locked on Malone. "You're not going anywhere until you hear me out," he said, his voice unwavering. "I called my mom. She's on her way." Helen let out a harsh laugh, folding her arms. "Oh, please," she said, her tone mocking. "What's your mom going to do? Lecture us about fairness? Save it, kid." Ethan's eyes darkened, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he addressed Malone directly. "You want to do your job?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. "Check the cameras. See for yourself what happened." Cruz glanced at Malone, his expression uneasy. "He's got a point, Sarge," he said quietly. "We should at least look at the footage." Malone's jaw ticked, his eyes narrowing at Cruz's suggestion, but before he could respond, Helen interjected, her voice frantic. "There's no need for that," she insisted, stepping closer to the officers. "I told you what happened. Are you seriously going to take his word over mine?" Ethan's gaze shifted to Emily, who stood frozen, her hands trembling. "Emily," he said, his voice softer but urgent, "you saw me come in. You know I wasn't doing anything wrong. Say something." Emily's eyes widened, her lips parting, but Helen's glare silenced her. "Stay out of this, Emily," Helen snapped, her voice like a whip. "You don't know what you're talking about." Emily's shoulders slumped, her gaze dropping to the floor, and Ethan's heart sank. The betrayal stung, but he refused to let it show. The customers' whispers grew louder, their words a jumble of speculation and prejudice. A man in a tweed jacket near the door muttered, "Should have stayed out of places like this." Ethan's head whipped toward him, his voice low but fierce. "Places like what?" he asked, challenging the man to repeat it. The man looked away, pretending not to hear. Malone stepped closer, his patience wearing thin. "Last chance, kid," he said, gripping the handcuffs. Move, or I'll make you move." Ethan's pulse raced, but he held his ground, his eyes blazing. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady. "My mom will be here any second, and you'll wish you'd listen to me." Helen rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with disdain. "Keep dreaming," she said. "No one's coming to save you." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel, but before Ethan could respond, the glass door swung open with a rush of air. A woman strode in, her navy blazer crisp, her heels clicking with precision against the tiles. Her presence commanded the room, silencing the whispers, halting Malone mid-step. She held up a badge, its gold surface gleaming under the chandeliers, and her voice rang out, clear and unyielding. "I'm Dr. Lauren Brooks, Chief of Police for Riverton PD, and that," she said, pointing at him, "is my son." The store fell into a stunned silence, the weight of her words crashing down like a tidal wave. Helen's face drained of color, her hand clutching the counter for support. Malone's grip on the handcuffs faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief. Cruz exhaled sharply, his posture relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. Clara Thompson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Emily's eyes filled with tears, her guilt now unmistakable. Ethan stood tall, his gaze meeting his mother's, a silent understanding passing between them. The storm had reached its peak, and now the reckoning was about to begin. The silence in Everstone Jewelers was deafening, a heavy shroud that smothered every whisper and rustle in the wake of Dr. Lauren Brooks' commanding entrance. Her badge gleamed under the chandeliers, a symbol of authority that shifted the room's power dynamic in an instant. Ethan stood tall, his gaze locked with his mother's, a quiet strength passing between them as the weight of Helen Carter's accusation crumbled. Helen gripped the counter, her knuckles white, her face drained of color as her earlier bravado dissolved into panic. Sergeant Richard Malone lowered his handcuffs, his jaw tight with unease, while Officer Daniel Cruz exhaled, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief and regret. Clara Thompson, the customer who had fueled the fire with her judgmental remarks, stood frozen, her hands still covering her mouth, her confidence shattered. Emily, the young employee, trembled at the edge of the counter, tears brimming in her eyes as her silence became a palpable burden. Lauren's piercing gaze swept the room, landing on Malone with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "Sergeant," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel, "explain to me why my son is standing here treated like a criminal without a shred of evidence." Malone cleared his throat, his voice strained. "We got a call, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward Helen. "She reported an attempted theft. We were just following protocol." Lauren's eyes narrowed, her tone cutting. "Protocol?" she asked, stepping closer. "You call pointing handcuffs at a teenager, ignoring his side of the story, protocol? What evidence did you have besides her word?" Malone's face reddened, but he held his ground. "She said she saw him try to take the bracelet," he replied, his voice defensive. "We had to act." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady but brimming with frustration. "She didn't see anything," he said, pointing at the bracelet on the floor. "It fell, that's all. She decided I was guilty before I even touched it." Helen's eyes darted to Ethan, her voice rising in desperation. "That's not true," she cried, her hands flailing. "He was sneaky, looking around, acting like he was up to no good. I know what I saw." Lauren turned to Helen, her expression unyielding. "What you saw, or what you assumed? Because from where I'm standing, you saw a black teenager and decided he didn't belong here." Helen's mouth opened, then closed, her face twisting with indignation. "I wasn't assuming anything," she snapped. "I've worked here for years. I know when someone's trying to pull something." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience visibly thinning. "Then prove it," she said, her voice like a blade. "Show me the security footage, now." Helen's eyes widened, her breath hitching, but she didn't move. Clara, sensing the tide turning, interjected, her voice shaky. "Maybe we should all calm down," she said, glancing nervously at Lauren. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Ethan turned to Clara, his eyes blazing. "A misunderstanding?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You called me typical and stood there while she accused me of stealing. What part of that was a misunderstanding?" Clara's face flushed, her hands twisting together. "I didn't mean it like that," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Lauren ignored her, focusing on Helen. "The footage," she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "Or do you have something to hide?" The store manager, Thomas Reed, who had been hovering silently in the background, finally stepped forward, his face pale. "I'll get it," he said, his voice trembling as he hurried to the back room. Emily, still standing at the counters, spoke up, her voice breaking. "I should have said something," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I knew he wasn't stealing. I've seen him here before, always looking at that bracelet for his sister." Ethan looked at Emily, his expression softening slightly, but his voice was firm. "Why didn't you?" he asked, the hurt evident in his tone. "You could have stopped this." Emily shook her head, her voice choked with guilt. "I was scared," she admitted. "Helen, she's my boss. I didn't know what to do." Lauren's gaze softened as she glanced at Emily. "You're speaking up now," she said, her voice gentler. "That's a start." The room fell silent as Thomas returned, fumbling with the small monitor. The security footage flickered to life, displaying a clear view of the counter. Every moment unfolded, even approaching, showing his money, holding the bracelet, and the accidental drop as it hit the floor. No attempt to pocket it, no suspicious movements, just a boy trying to buy a gift. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and damning. Helen's shoulders slumped, her face crumpling as the footage exposed her lie. Malone rubbed the back of his neck, his expression sour. Cruz looked at Ethan, his voice quiet. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, genuine regret in his eyes. "We should have checked first." Ethan nodded, but his gaze remained on Helen. "You knew," he said, his voice low but fierce. "You knew I wasn't doing anything wrong, but you called the police anyway. Why?" Helen's lips trembled, but she didn't answer, her eyes darting to the floor. Lauren stepped forward, her voice commanding. "Answer him," she said, her tone unyielding. "Why did you assume my son was a thief?" Helen's voice cracked as she spoke. I was protecting the store." She stammered, her words hollow. You thought wrong," Lauren cut in, her voice like a whip, "and your assumption could have ruined his life. You owe him more than an excuse." Helen's eyes filled with tears, but no apology came. Clara, now visibly shaken, spoke up, her voice trembling. "I didn't realize," she said, looking at Ethan. "I shouldn't have said those things. I was wrong." Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Words hurt," he said simply. "Maybe next time you'll think before you speak." Lauren turned to Malone, her voice cold. "What now, Sergeant? Are you still planning to arrest my son?" Malone shook his head, his voice tight. "No, ma'am," he said. "We'll clear this up and leave." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Not good enough," she said. "I want a formal report on this incident, and I'll be speaking to your captain about your rush to judgment." Malone's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Lauren turned to Helen, her voice deadly calm. "And as for you," she said, "expect a full investigation into this store's practices. If I find a pattern of this behavior, you'll answer for it." Helen's face crumpled, but she remained silent. Lauren took Ethan's arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Let's go, son," she said, her voice softening. Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on the bracelet, a symbol of his love for Mia, now tainted by this ordeal. He nodded, following his mother toward the door, the weight of the moment settling deep in his chest, a mix of vindication and exhaustion that would linger long after they left the store behind. The glass doors of Everstone Jewelers swung shut behind Ethan and Dr. Lauren Brooks, the soft chime fading into the warm afternoon air of Riverton. The golden sunlight bathed the sidewalk, but it did little to ease a knot in Ethan's chest. He walked beside his mother, her heels clicking with purpose, her posture radiating unyielding strength. Yet Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the ordeal lingering like a shadow. The victory, though undeniable, felt hollow, tainted by the sting of Helen Carter's accusations, the silent complicity of the customers, and Emily's hesitation. Lauren glanced at him, her sharp eyes softening with concern. "You holding up?" she asked, her voice low, stripped of the commanding tone she'd used inside. Ethan exhaled, his gaze fixed on the pavement. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I thought I'd feel better, like I'd prove something, but all I feel is tired." Lauren's jaw tightened, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have had to prove anything," she said with the quiet fury. "You walked in there to do something good, and they tried to tear you down for it. That's on them, not you." Ethan nodded, but his eyes drifted back to the store, its gleaming facade now a symbol of something far uglier. Inside, Helen stood motionless behind the counter, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge as if anchoring herself against the fallout. Sergeant Richard Malone and Officer Daniel Cruz were speaking to Thomas Reed, the manager, their postures stiff with discomfort. Clara Thompson lingered near the door, her face etched with unease, while Emily wiped her eyes, her guilt palpable even from a distance. Ethan's gaze hardened. "They didn't even say sorry," he said, his voice low. "Not really. They just backed off because you showed up." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "People like that rarely admit they're wrong," she said, her voice steady but heavy. "But they'll feel the consequences. I'll make sure of it." Ethan looked at her, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked, sensing the resolve in her tone. Lauren pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly as she dialed. "Cynthia," she said when the call connected, her voice crisp. "I need a press release drafted by tonight. Yes, about Everstone Jewelers. Include the false theft accusation, the lack of evidence, and Sergeant Malone's conduct. I want a public statement on racial profiling, and make sure the media knows Helen Carter's name." Ethan's eyes widened, a spark of surprise cutting through his exhaustion. "You're going public?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Lauren lowered the phone, meeting his gaze. "You think I'd let this slide?" she said, her tone fierce. "They tried to humiliate you, Ethan. They need to learn that actions have repercussions." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight in his chest easing slightly. The idea of accountability, of the world knowing what happened, felt like a small reclaiming of power. But before he could respond, the store's door opened and Clara stepped out, her steps hesitant. She clutched her purse, her eyes darting between Ethan and Lauren. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. I need to say something." Lauren raised an eyebrow, her expression guarded. "Go ahead," she said, folding her arms. Clara swallowed, her face flushed with shame. "I'm sorry." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "You judged me without knowing me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why?" Clara's eyes dropped to the ground, her hands twisting together. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. I assumed, and I was wrong." Ethan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Assumptions hurt people," he said. "Maybe next time you'll listen first." Clara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I will," she said, her voice soft. "I promise." She turned and walked away, her steps heavy with regret. Lauren nudged her go, then turned to Ethan. "That's one," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But we're not done." Ethan managed a small smile, but it faded as Emily emerged from the store, her face streaked with tears. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly. "Ethan," she said, her voice shaking, "I'm so sorry. I should have spoken up. I knew you weren't stealing, but I froze." Ethan's jaw tightened, the sting of her silence still fresh. "You could have changed everything," he said, his voice low. "Why didn't you?" Emily's lip trembled, her eyes glistening. "I was afraid of losing my job," she said, her voice breaking. "Helen's been here forever, and I didn't think anyone would believe me, but that's no excuse. I let you down." Ethan studied her, his anger warring with understanding. "Fear makes people do things they regret," he said finally, "but you're saying something now. That matters." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll do better," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I swear." Lauren placed a hand on Ethan's arm, her voice soft. "Come on, let's get out of here." They walked to her car in the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Ethan slid into the passenger seat, his body sinking into the leather, exhaustion seeping into his bones. Lauren started the engine, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "You did good in there," as she said, her voice quiet. "You stayed strong, even when it was hard." Ethan looked out the window, his voice barely above a whisper. "It shouldn't have to be this hard. I just wanted to make Mia happy." Lauren's eyes softened, but her voice was resolute. "I know," she said, "and you will. This doesn't change who you are." 3 days later, Everstone Jewelers was a lightning rod for controversy. News outlets ran stories about the incident, social media buzzed with outrage, and the store's reputation plummeted under a flood of negative reviews. Helen had been fired, and an investigation into the store's practices was underway. Malone faced a formal review, his body cam footage exposing his haste to detain Ethan. Ethan sat on the living room couch, scrolling through the headlines on his phone, the words blurring together. He should have felt triumphant, but the what-ifs lingered. If his mother hadn't been chief, if the cameras hadn't been there, how would it have ended? A squeal interrupted his thoughts. "Ethan, look." Mia bounded onto the couch, her wrist adorned with the silver charm bracelet, its star pendants twinkling. "Mom got it for me. It's so pretty." Ethan's chest tightened, a smile breaking through his fatigue. "You love it?" he asked, his voice warm. Mia grinned, nodding vigorously. "It's the best gift ever," she said, hugging him tightly. Ethan held her close, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. Mia's joy was worth it all. "I picked it out," he said, ruffling her hair. "That's what counts, right?" Mia nodded, her eyes sparkling. As she ran off to show their mother, Ethan leaned back, exhaling. The fight wasn't over, but for now, this moment was enough. The story of Ethan Brooks at Everstone Jewelers is a powerful reminder of the deep-rooted impact of prejudice and the resilience needed to confront it. Ethan, a young black teen, faced baseless accusations of theft simply for existing in a space where Helen Carter deemed him unworthy. Her snap judgment, fueled by racial bias, nearly cost Ethan his dignity, reflecting how systemic discrimination poisons everyday interactions. Yet, Ethan's composure and his mother Lauren's fierce advocacy exposed the truth, proving that justice demands courage and accountability. Clara's regret and Emily's belated honesty highlight the importance of challenging complicity, even when fear tempts silence. The story teaches us that assumptions can wound, but standing firm in one's truth can spark change. It urges us to question biases, listen before judging, and amplify marginalized voices. Ethan's fight wasn't just for himself, but for everyone who's ever been unfairly targeted. While the victory was bittersweet, Mia's joy with her bracelet symbolizes hope amidst struggle. This narrative calls us to build a world where respect is universal, not selective. Let's spread this message to inspire action against injustice. Like, share, and subscribe with notifications on to catch more compelling stories that challenge, uplift, and unite us.